Hi! In this clip, we are going to focus on creating a multiple-step workflow with decisions and tasks. We are going to implement a scenario for our Globomantics company. Firstly, we'll have a task that generates a PDF report. We'll be using a Lambda function to hold our logic. Next, we'll have an encryption step. Some clients have sensitive data, so they want their reports to be encrypted before sent anywhere. The encryption step will also be a serverless Lambda function. Based on the encryption settings of the customer, we'll make the choice whether we need to encrypt or not encrypt our document. After the encryption step, we'll have an email step. This will send the actual file to the client. The generated PDF file and the encrypted PDF file will be saved on Amazon S3 storage. And finally, we have a cleanup step. We don't want our files to stay on S3 for no reason after they are sent. So, after the email step has been completed, we want to clean up the generated PDF files as well. Let's get started. First, let's check the logic for our serverless Lambda functions. For this demo, I'm using Node.js serverless functions, but you can use the programming language of your choice. The report generation Lambda function doesn't actually generate a real report, but it generates a PDF file with some demo data. The demo data is placed on Amazon S3 storage, and a link to that file is outputted as a result. Next, we have our encryption function. This will encrypt the report and store it on S3 just like the previous function, and output the link to the encrypted file. The email function will receive the file as an input, an email address to send it to, and a subject. Using that information, it will send out an email and include the PDF report as an attachment. And finally, our cleanup step will delete the two generated files from storage, so we don't gather unnecessary files on our storage. You will find the Lambda functions used in this demo in the exercise files for the course. Let's go ahead and create a new workflow. This workflow will not have high event rate workloads, so let's leave the type as standard. I have already prepared the workflow definition for this demo. We are going to go through it step by step and explain each step in detail. If we refresh the diagram, we can see a preview of how our workflow will look. Let's start with our first state, which is going to be a task state that will invoke the PDF generation Lambda function. To do that, we specify the resource, which will be Lambda, and we'll use the invoke API. And in the parameters section, we specify the function name, which will be the function ARN. This function does not require any input. For a real-life scenario, ideally, this would take in some sort of client ID or another identifier, but for our demo, this won't require any input. So, in the payload section, we won't pass anything. For the output, we need to use a result path property to map our function output to a specific variable. So, the next step execution does not override the workflow output. Let's name this step's output report generation output. Next, we are going to have a pass state. Pass states are useful when we want to map some data to the output. In our case, when we call our email step, we want to know from which step we came from, and we shouldn't. And also, our email step also shouldn't care if it's sending the encrypted file or the unencrypted file. All it needs to know is which file to send. So, we are going to use a pass state to map a set of parameters. We are going to map the report generation output into two properties, email file and unencrypted file. We are going to override the email file on the encryption step if we reach it. And we are going to use the unencrypted file in the encryption step and in the cleanup step later on. Using result path, we will save this data in the report options.report data. Next, we have a choice state. Here, we'll make the decision to encrypt the report or not. We are going to use the property should encrypt on the report options object. If the value is set to true, we move to the encryption step, otherwise, we move to the email step. Next, we'll have the encryption step. The encryption step is going to point to the encryption Lambda function. For the input, it's only going to need the unencrypted report file path we generated on the first step. The output of the encryption step will be the encrypted file location on Amazon S3, and that result will be stored on a property called encryption output, which we specify using the result path. Before we go to the email step, we need to add another pass state. Here, we are going to override the email file property so it now points to the encrypted file, and also set the encrypted file property so we can use it later in the cleanup step. Now, In our parameters, we need to specify email file, an encrypted file, and an unencrypted file. And all these properties will now be available in the report options.report data, which we can use on the email step and in the cleanup step. Next, we have the email step. This will use the email lambda function, and as an input, we'll have the client email, subject, body, and the property called email file. The email file property will have the encrypted report if the encryption was required, otherwise it will have the unencrypted report if encryption was not required. And finally, after the email step, we have the cleanup step. This step will take in a parameter, a list of files, or an object with our files. Currently, there is no way to create an array on a step function definition, so we'll be passing an object of files. The cleanup function is smart enough to determine between an array and an object and delete all the files specified. This will be our last item on the workflow, so we need to set the end property to true. Now that we have completed our workflow definition, let's create the workflow. Let's give it a descriptive name, and for the role, we are going to leave it as create new role. This will create a role based on the definition of the workflow, which will give it the appropriate permissions. Once the workflow has been created, let's start a new execution using the Start Execution button. We are going to pass our options in an object called Report Options. We need to specify a client email, an email subject, an email body, and should encrypt to tell it to encrypt our report or not. In this case, we are choosing to encrypt our report. Once the workflow execution starts, we can see in the diagram steps being executed one after the other. The blue color indicates that the step execution is in progress, and green means it's complete. And once the execution of the workflow is completed, if we check our inbox, we should have an email with a specified subject, body, and a PDF attachment that we cannot open since it's encrypted. If we look at our inbox, we can see that an email has arrived, and if we try to open the PDF file, we should not be able to. Now, let's execute our workflow again without requiring encryption. We can do that by using the new execution button at the top right corner. Let's change the should encrypt property to false. Once we execute our workflow, if we look at the diagram, the encryption step shouldn't be executed this time around since we set it to false. And when the workflow is completed, if we check our email, we should have a PDF file attached that we can read now. And indeed, we have a PDF file attached that we can read. For this demo, we are going to trigger the workflow using the API gateway. First, we need to create a new API. Once in the API gateway console, let's create a new API using the Create API button. We are going to build a REST API, so let's choose REST and click Build. Let's give it a descriptive name and create the API. Once the API is created, we need to add a method. We can do that using the Create Method option on the Actions button. For the method type, we can use GET or POST. POST is a more appropriate method for this kind of operation since we are triggering something and not asking for data. Once we create our endpoint, we get to set up the service integration for our method. In the integration type, we need to choose AWS service. Once we do that, we get the option to select a region and a service. My region is US East 1 or North Virginia. And for the AWS service, we are going to need to choose Step Functions. Next, we need to select an HTTP method. For our case, it's going to be POST. The last remaining options are Action and Execution Role. For action, we need to specify the value Start Execution. We can find a list of actions on the Amazon Step Function documentation page. And finally, for the execution role, we need to create a new role which has access to AWS Step Functions. Let's navigate to the Access Management console and create a new role. For the Trusted Entity type, we are going to choose AWS Service. And on the list of services, we need to choose API Gateway. And finally, let's give it a name and a description. Once the role has been created, let's open it and attach some permissions to it. This role needs to be able to execute state machines. To keep things simple, let's give it full access to AWS Step Functions. Now that our role has the appropriate permissions, let's copy the role ARN and go to the API Gateway setup. In the execution role, let's paste the newly created role ARN. And finally, let's save our API. The API Gateway has built-in testing support that we can use to test our API integration. Clicking on the test button will bring up the test UI. In the request body, we need to provide the following options. A name for the execution, then we need to specify the state machine ARN, and finally, we need to pass an input. The input is a string property, so before we can pass our JSON, we need to stringify it. If the request was successful, in our response body, we should see the execution ARN and a start date for the execution. If we look at the execution history, We have an execution with the name we gave API Gateway Execution 1, which was successful.